Alright, so Hurricane Beryl was shocking to me. Absolutely shocking. We have to discuss this. We just have to discuss this. Now, Hurricane Beryl was a storm that began out over the Atlantic and between all of its stages wound up tracking somehow 6,000 miles. I don't understand how. It set multiple records for both location and intensity in the month of June in the Atlantic, because it started off pretty far in the east and became the first Category 4 hurricane on record in the Atlantic in the month of June. That wasn't enough for it though. It then jumped up to Category 5 level on July 1st as it swallowed up Tropical Storm Chris. So yes, the next storm will start with a D. And it was interesting, I think, to me because of how Alberto and Beryl pretty much affected similar areas. But obviously Beryl is going to be far, far, far worse. And there's layers to Beryl. Because obviously it tore through the Caribbean, it scraped Jamaica as a Category 5, and it also affected several other areas at a high intensity. So in the Caribbean itself, we're looking at about 15 deaths throughout the area. Venezuela was affected. The tip of the country was affected by the storm, but Venezuela is a country that's not very wealthy. So that could be catastrophic too. Then Hurricane Beryl wound up glazing the peninsula of Mexico. It glazed the peninsula of Mexico, which wound up not really causing that much damage because by that point it was only down to a Category 3, I think, and it was weakening too. It weakened to a tropical storm. And then all eyes were on what would happen when it hit Texas and that stuff. Because I think that what happened in the U.S. alone would make the storm go down in the history textbooks. Because it was bad. So first of all, how did Beryl affect my area? Before I get into everything else. The answer is not really much. Beryl did bring an annoying plume of humidity on Wednesday, but even though the dew points reached 75 degrees, there were two factors that made it not really stand out. Number one, the dew points were already in the 70s, so they only notched up about a degree. And number two, the breeze made it feel cooler. The gusts were up to about 40 miles an hour. Rainfall itself, though, barely any across the metro area. Somehow, the Republic Airport in Farmingdale, the closest reporting station to where I live, recorded only 0.01 inch of rain. I personally think the total might have been a little higher. 0.11 inches of rain at Central Park, 0.19 in Islip, but many areas barely had any rain. They'll see more rain from the ghost of the storm on Saturday, Friday also, but that really can't count. You can't say that the floods that tore through New York City on September 29th were, that connected to Tropical Storm Ophelia, unlike the floods on the Mid-Atlantic from September 23rd to 26th, which you can at least somewhat connect them to Ophelia. This is different. This is different. Beryl was only a Category 1 storm at landfall. So the preparations weren't really that intensive. But it did cause almost 3 million power outages. And here's what you have to understand. In Texas, that can be catastrophic. You first have to understand a few things. The Texas power grid is not that good as it is. We saw what happened in February 2021. A catastrophic winter storm struck through the state of Texas, dropping record amounts of snow in some areas, although most areas really only received about 6 inches, but that's catastrophic in Texas. Temperatures also dropped to historic levels. You might think, for example, instead of Houston at a low of 15 degrees isn't that cold, and a high of 28 isn't either, and people were just whining. That's catastrophic in Texas. That's the same as if temperatures in Alaska wound up hitting 90 degrees. It can get really bad. And the further north they went, I mean, the more winterized they were, but the colder it got too. Some areas saw record-breaking low temperatures, although most of them had seen this level of coldness before, but the power grid could not handle it. And it resulted in the deaths of 200 people, at least. And damage totals were at least $25 billion, and very possibly were much more than $25 billion. But they were at least $25 billion, which is just insane for a winter storm. Tropical cyclones, yes, tropical cyclones causing $25 billion in damage, they happen pretty often. Look at Hurricane Ian. Look at Hurricane Ida, Hurricane Maria, Michael, Florence, Irma, Harvey, obviously Katrina, Hurricane Ike, Hurricane Sandy, even going back to 1992, Hurricane Andrew, and Ivan also can join in on the $25 billion club. But for a winter storm, it's absolutely insane because they don't have some advantage that tropical cyclones have in causing these insane totals. So, the grid is weak, and Texas summers are known to be unbearable. Dew points can cross 80 degrees at times, which, remember how I said 75 degrees felt like hell? Well, 80 is going to be a notch up from even that. Even in Florida, dew points of 80 degrees are rare. It's hot and humid all the time, and you know, you'll see dew points always roaming around in the mid to upper 70s, but to actually cross 80 is another level of hell. And temperatures reach the 90s to even 100s as well, so the heat indexes are usually about 115 degrees, and they can get even hotter. I actually think of markers. So what I can do right now is write down the heat index in the city yesterday. That's what it was, from a combination of this air temp and this dew point. Now the wet bulb temperature from this is only going to be about 80 degrees. It doesn't seem catastrophic, but it produces that much of a heat index. My area was thankfully much lower. Thankfully my area was much lower. But still, you see what I'm saying. And that felt like hell, obviously. So it's like, imagine it's somehow even worse than that on both fronts, both temperature and humidity. And without power, you're not going to have AC. So there are going to be a lot of deaths from this. We saw this from Hurricane Ida. Initially, the death toll in Louisiana wasn't that high, and it seemed like the most catastrophic impacts were going to be in the Northeast. And while that was sort of true, the impacts in Louisiana did get worse as time went on. Now, Beryl isn't going to have the same catastrophe in the Northeast as this, but its impact did stretch up the U.S. There was a fatality in both Louisiana and Vermont in association with the storm system. Arkansas saw heavy flooding. A St. Louis Cardinals game got postponed due to the inclement weather. Record-breaking tornado outbreak both for northwestern Louisiana and in western New York, especially given the fact that this occurred in July. But really, any time of the year, this tornado outbreak would be considered pretty intense and extreme. Not just given the fact of the time of year. Now, these tornadoes, thankfully, the death toll is limited to just one, but still. And there were 11 deaths in Texas as well. You had high winds because it was still a Category 1 storm, And of course you had the flooding too. 5 inches of rain in downtown Houston, up to 15 in the state. That's really bad. And again, the storm mostly missed my area, which probably isn't great for the drought. But further north, this is going to provide a really big blow. Speaking of which, before I end, just to recap the drought here and how it got, to this point. Basically, you have to understand March was really wet and we saw multiple flood events. And it looked like April was going to be wet too after we already had over 2 inches of rain in the first 3 days of the month from a nor'easter. Unfortunately, after that, the precipitation pattern slowed. We got about a half inch of rain on April 11th into the 12th. But after that, barely anything fell. I am not even kidding. Barely anything fell after that point. It was mostly just completely dry after that point in April. May promised to change things up. And to an extent it did, I want to say. To an extent it did. But it wasn't convincing at first. Because again, you have these same lackluster showers that really don't add to the rainfall totals. Eventually, and somewhat thankfully, we did start to get action from some big storms that dropped lots of rain. May 23rd is an example, May 27th, May 29th. And then on June 6th, we had another one of these. That's actually when the temperature in New York City jumped to 76 degrees, which I think so far is the highest point it hit all summer. Fingers crossed it stays that way, because thankfully that day the temperature was held into the low 80s. Now, as for after that, again, barely anything. And I will say that some of the storms that hit the city do get more intense on the island, like June 14th is a good example. But then you have the storms on like June 22nd that deliver, maybe it's meager rain, but they deliver some rain to the city, barely any here. The storms on the 26th to the 27th, again, they didn't really do that much. Same for the 29th into the 30th. And July so far has been very lackluster in terms of rain. I'm hoping that changes, because this little rainfall, it's going to get unsustainable really quickly. But for the drought, it's not looking great. It's not looking great.